Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today, we're joined by Dr. Timothy Buschman, a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton University. His lab investigates how the brain generates intelligent, goal-directed behavior by focusing on interactions between different parts of the brain and studying how networks of neurons work together to produce what we call executive control. Dr. Buschman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, my first question for you is what is executive control and why is it important to study?
Yeah, so executive control is just basically your ability to control your own actions, your own behavior. And it's important, it's kind of critical for all intelligent behavior. So as the world around us adapts and as our bodies change, right, as our needs change, as we get hungry or thirsty, as we have different demands, right, we have to do homework, we have, interested in doing something fun for a while, right? You have to be able to kind of direct your behavior towards achieving those goals. And that's essentially what executive control is doing. It's allowing you to decide what you want to do and how you should basically accomplish those goals. Like what is the best way for you to achieve whatever your goal is in the current situation. And you're always adapting to changes, like I said, both in your internal changes as well as external changes in the world around you. And without that, you kind of can get locked in to you know, doing behaviors that are not necessarily in kind of your best interest for that in that moment in time, right? So a lot of different neuropsychiatric diseases and neurodegenerative diseases will affect executive control, and so understanding exactly what are the mechanisms that support executive control can kind of help provide insight into those diseases and what goes wrong
Yeah.
in that.
So when I was looking at your work, this term of or this phrase of cognitive Legos seemed to come up, and I'm just curious. Could you explain a little bit about what you mean by these cognitive Legos, and how this maybe connects to your research on the brain and executive function?
Yeah, so to me, one of the most remarkable things about human behavior is our ability to kind of do new things and learn new things incredibly quickly, right? So the example that I always think of is, my family likes to play kind of new board games, and we often will get a new board game for the holidays, and we'll sit around and play it together. Um, and it's pretty remarkable that like you could sit down to play a new board game. You've never played it before, right? You can read the instructions. It's always my job to read the instructions, right? So you can read the instructions or have somebody explain the instructions to you. And then you can play the game, right? And you're not like perfect at the game, but you follow the rules, you can make strategic decisions, right? Like, and this is a fairly to me again, like a fairly remarkable
Yep.
ability. Like that humans are able to do this. It's not that you don't need 1,000 exposures to the game, right? This is like something that you can really pick up and kind of do in one shot. And I think this is sort of just to kind of drive home the point. This is a little bit different from like current AI models, for example, right? That like are trained on thousands, if not tens of
Yeah.
thousands of human lifetimes worth of data in order to get or start to even approximate kind of intelligent behavior. And so this to me is always stuck out as something that's like really kind of special to human cognition and to animal cognition more broadly. And so when we were thinking about this, lots of people have thought about like, okay, what might support this type of like really rapid ability to do, new tasks. And one idea is this idea of compositionality. And compositionality is basically your ability to kind of put together pieces of tasks that you maybe have already learned in order to like, form a new task, right? So in the case of a board game, right, like you know how to roll die, you know how to count pips, you know how to move pieces, you know how to like think strategically about odds, right? These are all things that you've kind of learned through other board games, other that you may have played in the past. And so now the idea is that you can kind of put them together in a new way in order to perform the new task, the new game. And so again, like a lot of people have been interested in this like ability of compositionality. I think it's mostly been studied through language, right? Language is perhaps the
Oh
most
yeah.
famous example of compositionality, right? Our ability to kind of put together words into sentences and sentences into paragraphs and be able to generate completely new thoughts and ideas from the same sort of core set of abilities. And so And so, yeah, so this is what we were interested in trying to understand is like, how does the brain actually have um, these different parts, and then how does it put it together? And so, the cognitive Legos is referring to this ability, right? Where the idea is that you can have kind of pieces of maybe like subtasks that you can kind of snap together to form and build a more complex task.
Yeah.
And so I'm happy. I mean, if you're interested, I could tell you about the study that we did that sort of looked at these cognitive Legos.
Yeah,
Does that
real
sound
quick, I
familiar?
actually thought you might find this interesting. So one thing that I do a lot is I'm actually a speed cuber. So I do a lot of like Rubik's cubes. I go to Rubik's cube competitions. I just went to one a few weeks ago. And the great thing about Rubik's cubes is and the reason I think they're so fun and appealing to me at least, and I solve them for hours on end, is I use the same technique every single time to solve the cube, and I probably solved it like hundreds of thousands of times over the past couple of years. But every single time I get a fresh new permutation of it because in total there are 43 quintillion something possibilities of or arrangements of the cube. So each time I'm never seeing something I've really seen before or able to recall, but I'm still using that same like technique. And the reason I'm just bringing this up is I just saw some parallels with this kind of idea of cognitive Legos and building together what or piecing together what our brain already knows or tasks that our brain's already familiar with into dealing with what's new. So I thought that was
Yeah.
interesting. But if you
Yeah,
could
no,
tell us
that's
more about the
exactly
study
right. Yeah.
too, that would be cool. But
Sure. Yeah.
yeah,
So, in our study, the way that we were trying to understand what was going on is that we decided that we were going to train animals, in this case monkeys, to sort of
yeah. Okay.
perform multiple tasks. And so we trained them to do to sort of look at stimuli, and these stimuli were um, these like little morph shapes that we created. And so they kind of morphed from something that kind of looked like a T, right? So it kind of had something like this to kind of something that looked like a bunny, right? So like the edges of the T kind of swung up a bit.
Okay.
There were other changes, but like that's sort of how we always started calling them T's and bunnies. Um, and then they also were different colors. So they could be red or they could be green, and they could actually morph. In both cases, they would morph from a T to a bunny, or they could morph from red to green in a continuous way. So they actually could be any color in the entire kind of rainbow. Um, but like they were categorizing them as either being more red or more green, and more like a T or more like a bunny. And
Yeah.
so you can think of this as kind of like two different ways that you can kind of take a single stimulus, right? Something like a, you know, their version of the Rubik's Cube, right? And they can kind of parse it out into two different features. Um, and then we had two different ways in which they were responding to tell us whether or not it was a T or a bunny, or was it red or green, the exact stimulus that they were seeing. And every trial was sort of a new stimulus that they were, they couldn't, that didn't necessarily had seen that exact stimulus before. They were kind of always generalizing their ability to kind of do T-ness versus bunniness, or redness versus greenness, and then responding one way or another. And then what we were doing is we were recording from the brain as the animals were doing this task, and we were able to find that there was kind of different there's like representation of each kind of subcomponent of the tasks. So like if one task involved judging whether the color was green and red, and then mapping it onto, one way of responding, versus another task that was like, shape to your bunny, and then mapping it onto the same way of responding. Right. Then we found that that part that was, the response part was shared across those two different tasks. And the
Oh,
same way. So
wow.
if we had the animal doing like color red versus green, but responding in two different ways for two different tasks, that kind of red greenness was again shared across these different tasks. And so, essentially, if the animal was doing kind of this one particular task where they were, say, judging red versus green and then mapping it onto one particular motor response, they could take their kind of subcomponents that were associated with other tasks and kind of snap them together to perform this sort of third task, basically, in this
Yeah,
case.
it's very
Um,
fascinating. So one of the things you mentioned earlier about artificial intelligence actually caught my attention because I think right now, when we look at the world, we're seeing all these AI models that are, kind of, I think people feel like threatened, like, oh, are these going to like replace my thinking? And especially like artists, for example. My last interview, actually, we were talking about how artificial intelligence can't really replace like human art. But I'm just curious, like, how do you see AI, like, for example, relate to this idea of cognitive Legos? Like, how is AI thinking different than human thinking when we're kind of thinking about it from this perspective?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think. we're still very much early days in terms of like understanding exactly how these AI systems are
Hmm.
working.
Yeah.
If you train a neural network, an artificial neural network, to do the types of tasks that our monkeys were doing, you see a very similar type of representation where the neural network will kind of build these like little subtask representations and then put them together in the way that very similar way to kind of what our monkeys were doing. Um, that type of sort of artificial neural networks are very different than the types of AI that most people are interacting with today, right? Either through LLMs or through these sort of generative AI for generating art or images or music or
Hmm.
whatever. It's a very different type of artificial neural network, and these sort of more complex systems. Again, we're still fairly early in trying to understand exactly how they're working, but I think you know the little that we've been able to look at is seems to be that they are doing a lot of very similar things to kind of how humans are generating language, for example. They seem to have kind of similar predictions about what the next word should be in a sentence. They seem to have similar kind of like symbolic representations that they're able to kind of carry around, right? And use. So, for example, if you're talking about a particular person like Harry, right? Like I think the classic examples from like the Harry Potter books, right? Um, you can look and you can see that like, it has a representation that's kind of very flexible, almost symbolic, like that can kind of be labeled with this, the Harry name and then be used later on, right? It's able to kind of copy it around. So there's a lot of things that are I think very similar.
Hmm.
Um, you know, whether or not this type of kind of flexible use of subspaces and being able to kind of piece things together in the same way that the monkeys are doing and we think humans are doing as well. Yeah, that's still we still have to see whether or not how
Right.
much that is also true in AI. I mean, I think one of the hopes of our research, of course, is to try to, gain deeper insight into human cognition for the reason I was saying at the beginning, right? So we can understand human disease better.
Yeah.
Um, but you can also imagine, ways to improve artificial intelligence, right? So taking some of
Sure.
these
Yeah.
ideas, and being able to, you know, change maybe the architecture that AI is using, to sort of speed up the ability for these networks to learn. Again, like there's a vast differences between, how quickly people learn and how quickly these machines learn.
Yeah.
So, um, and there's huge energy constraints, right? I mean, there's all sorts
Oh
of
yeah,
reasons why you
absolutely.
would want to speed it up. I mean, data efficiency,
Yeah.
energy efficiency, yeah, everything. So.
So, continuing back on this idea of the blocks, right? These building blocks, Legos. Let's say you don't use like certain blocks for an extended period of time. Like what happens? Do those blocks kind of fade over time? Is that kind of like related to memory? Or I guess how are these like blocks stored in our brain kind of?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't really know yet.
Yeah.
I think uh, we don't know whether or not like we don't know how you learn new ones yet, and we don't know what
Yeah.
happens as sort of you don't use them, like and potentially you forget them. Um, we do think that, of course, they are probably stored in some form of long-term memory.
Okay.
This doesn't mean episodic memory, of course. It could be some sort of procedural memory that you
Right.
are holding on to as well. Um, so we do think that these kind of stick around. I mean, I think there's also ideas that um, they may kind of, again, the idea is that is as you are learning new tasks, right, you're kind of always building on previous knowledge.
Yeah.
And so if that's the case, then you're not really throwing away previous
Hmm.
knowledge, right? You're
Okay.
kind of using it for a new purpose. And so in that way, you can imagine it kind of almost protects you from losing kind of
Yeah.
previous knowledge because it's, everything you're doing is kind of always um, done in a way that's kind of leveraging this. And so
Yeah.
um, we think of this as kind of a way to maybe avoid things like forgetting, right? Which is a big deal again in artificial neural networks. There's something called catastrophic forgetting, catastrophic interference, right? That occurs when you train a neural network to do one task, and then you train it to do another task. It completely
Huh.
forgets the first task,
Yeah.
right? Which is again a big difference between
Right.
people and models. And so why is it that animals and people don't forget? And we think that this kind of reuse may be part of the answer to that
Okay.
question.
So you did mention something about just now about how we don't know exactly or the entire process of how these cognitive blocks are learned. But I'm curious, are we born with any cognitive blocks? And the reason I ask this is because and I might be mistaken, but I believe we're born with like two fears. One fear is of heights, and another fear is of loud noises. And I might be mistaken there, but I mean, I we are there are some fears that we are born with. I think. That's for sure. And I'm just curious, like, does that connect to this idea of are we born with certain cognitive blocks that we then continue to build on as we start to be exposed to the world?
Yeah, it's another great question, another like really deep debate, I think,
Yeah.
in the field that's gone back for decades, if not centuries at this point, about how much of behavior is really innate, that you're kind of
Yeah.
born with, and how much of it is learned.
Mhm.
And yeah, you'll get different kind of opinions from anybody that you talk to. I don't know that anybody has a complete answer yet. You know, personally, I guess I'm more on the side of the debate that would argue that the brain doesn't there so there totally are innate things, right, that you're
Right.
born with, right? Like as you were
Yeah.
pointing out, right?
Yeah.
And there's certain reflexes that you're born with.
Hmm.
But in general, humans tend to be compared to other animals, right? Like, a horse will be standing up and walking around in like, minutes, right? As
Yeah.
opposed to a year for a baby,
Right.
right? A human baby, right? So, compared to other animals, human development is very, very much prolonged. And so I guess I tend to be on the side of debate that would argue that it's really about setting up the kind of architecture in the brain. How is it that the brain is learning? What are the mechanisms that the brain is using to learn that really determine and allow us to be so kind of intelligent and flexible in our behaviors? So yeah, we definitely don't know yet. So I
Right.
don't,
Right.
but
Yeah.
like if I had to guess, my guess would be you're not born with any particular at this level, you're not born with like knowing how to like say categorize things into red versus green. Of course you
Right.
have red versus green as like a percept, but you don't know, you don't have those labels, you don't have any of that.
Hmm.
But you do have the capacity to learn them and you have the capacity to learn them really quickly. And then once you learn them, to reuse them in many kind of flexible ways. So
Yeah.
um yeah.
So my final question for you is more of a futuristic outlook. And I know you've mentioned how the goal of this research is kind of to inform, disease and an understanding of disease and how it might affect executive control. So looking ahead, what like big questions or research projects or unsolved mysteries, which I know there are a lot of, as we've talked about in this interview, about this executive control, are you most excited to kind of tackle?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of already hit on a couple of things that we're really interested in. I mean, a big one is um, what happens as you're learning a task. So, when you're working with animals, right? The reason why we work with animals is because, they provide a level of insight that you can't get with humans, right?
Hmm.
And so that is why we work with animals. But one of the sort of constraints in working with animals is that, you have to tend to train them for a long time to sort of
Yeah.
perform a task. And so oftentimes when you're studying the brain, right, an animal's brain, like you're studying it kind of after it's already learned. Um, Whereas oftentimes when you're studying humans' brains, oftentimes in that case, like you're studying them almost as they're learning. Like it's very rare. I mean, there are cases, but like most of the time, if you're bringing a human subject in to kind of do a task, um, that's kind of the first time they've seen that task, right? Again, they know how to do similar things, right? Like they're
Right.
bringing a lot of knowledge to the table, but like, whatever random stimulus that you're showing them, or if you're sitting in a scanner while doing a task, like you've probably never been in that scanner before, right? Like there's a lot going on that you're dealing with that's new. Um, and so these are just two very, very different kind of ways of studying the brain. It's like, again, animals tend to be kind of very much after learning, traditionally very much after learning, and humans tend to be kind of during learning. And so one of the things that we're really interested in is trying to understand how we can study this learning process. And And we've been doing a little bit of stuff like that in our lab now already, and we're continuing to do it as we move forward. And I think that's really kind of going to be an interesting question for all the reasons that we talked about, right? Like how is it that these things come about? How do you learn to use them but not overwrite them? Like all these like interesting questions. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're hoping to see over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's definitely exciting. Yeah, I mean, I'm just glad that, the Rubik's Cubes is now this conversation has given me a different perspective on the Rubik's Cubes because I do feel like sometimes, like when I'm doing Rubik's Cubes and maybe I'm, doing like math work or something after for my classes, I do feel like I'm somehow able to find like connections between, how I'm solving it and the approaches I'm using. And I'm always wonder, I guess, like what my brain's like, kind of using to help me make those connections. And I think it's always interesting to think about these kind of the patterns that evolution has allowed our brains to become so advanced and so good at what we do, right? So
Yeah.
on that note, Dr. Bushman, thank you so much for joining me today. This is a
Yeah,
really
thanks.
insightful conversation for me.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
fun.